Laguna Beach Historical Society. Thank you all for coming tonight, and if you would like some water, there's some water in the back, there's some cups to fill your glasses. I want to thank the terrific, hardworking fellow board members, including President John Hoover, and our History Society member supporters. And for those who become members, you can select one of a range of benefits we offer, which helps support the cost of putting on our 3 or so presentations per year, plus other expenses. And for those seeking more information about the Historical Society and Laguna history, please go to info@lagunabeachhistory.org. Before going into tonight's presentation, we have another special event coming up sooner than usual on December 3rd. Consider it an early holiday gift courtesy of the History Society, a panel presentation on our local iconic figure, Skipper Carrillo, also known as Mr. Uniform. Back decades when he was taking care of high school uniforms. Focusing now tonight, Scott Case, coming up from downtown San Diego, but a Lagunan, an artist, graduated from Laguna High, and his cousin, Ted Cheek, who are great-grandsons of the Thurston family, recently collaborated on this publication called Children of Aliso. It is a first-person account with photographs of the Thurston family who settled and homesteaded 152 acres of the beautiful Aliso Canyon in 1871. This memoir was written from 1935 and 1948 by Harriet Thurston. The original manuscript remained uncirculated and not available to local historians and others for all these years. And for both of them, it's a great pleasure to make this book available to the community, to historians. And Scott has graciously come to talk about it. His parents even live up here, which is great, so we can get a twofer here. Harriet Thurston describes Children of Aliso as, quote, the story of a single family of pioneers taken from among the many who formed an integral part of the romantic Southland in days that are forever gone. Not simply from the standpoint of the passing of time, but of the vanishing of an era. Enjoy the presentation.
Well, thank you, Roger, for that introduction. I'm going to have to button up this so we get the mic close. How's the sound check for you?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Talk a little louder.
All right. Hey, so a short summary of my background. As Roger mentioned, I was born and raised here in Laguna, graduated in '77, and my interest in Laguna Beach history was sparked back in 1971 at the Thurston Centennial event that was held down in Aliso Canyon, sponsored by the Laguna Beach Historical Society. So it was during that decade that I became very involved with the Historical Society, and was also very fortunate to be mentored by local historians, Merle and Mabel Ramsey, who wrote several books on local history. They encouraged my curiosity and my research, so it's just a wonderful time. And so for my cousin Ted and myself, it's really a pleasure to get this book published and available to the community. So this is a little bit of a recap, but just a broad overview of the book itself. It is the story of the Thurston family who settled in Aliso Canyon in 1871. It was written by one of their daughters, Harriet, who was born in 1876 on the farm. And it's her first-person account of pioneering life in Laguna Beach. As Roger mentioned, it was kind of written over a long period until her passing in 1948. And it was just published early this year in 2024 by both Ted and I, who are descendants of that family. So some of Harriet's topics include the transformation of that barren wilderness into a sustainable farm. She describes their initial isolation there in the canyon and some of the early neighbors and homesteaders as they started moving into the canyon. Also the economic impacts of the 1880s real estate boom and bust. And she also talks about the economic depression in the 1890s that impacted the Southland as well as the rest of the nation. Interspersed in her story, she describes the beautiful landscapes, the flora, and the fauna. Education and schools are very important to her. You'll see that as kind of one of her core themes that she always returns to in her books. She'll describe the daily life on the farm, their relationships, their hardships, their entertainment, their fun, and also just life with the neighbors and in the neighboring communities. So tonight, what I want to do for an outline is I want to provide some historical context for the Thurston family, just a short one. Where did they come from and how did they get here? Then we'll listen to Harriet's introductory remarks about her book. I'll provide an overview of the 75 years to get this book published and available to the community. And then we'll dive into these themes and stories that I've kind of pulled out for the presentation tonight.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, okay. They moved into Aliso Canyon, as Roger mentioned, November 1871. They homesteaded 152 acres. They arrived with 6 children, ranging ages from 3 months to just short of 12 years old. And one aspect of their story, as I read through this, is how they just managed to survive. Such a harsh environment with the droughts that we have here in the Southland, the floods, accidents, both personal injury as well as property damage that impacted their ability to survive and live, along with illnesses. Well, a total of 13 children lived on the farm, eventually coming of age and moving into the surrounding communities. Joe Thurston, one of the sons, he remained to work the farm and manage it. Well, the farm then passed the creditors at the time of the Great Depression around 1929.
Where did they move from?
Great question.
Sorry, you're going to cover that?
Yeah, no, we'll be right there. Yeah, thank you. So here's a picture of the Thurston family, the mother with 13 kids. In the back left there, with a kind of black tie around her neck, that is our author, Harriet. That is Ted Cheek's great-grandmother. And I also just want to take a quick moment to Ted's sister Angela is here, sitting next to my wife in the back. So she's also Harriet. So thank you for joining us. And then my great-grandmother is right in front of Harriet, in the middle row on the left. That's Artemisia. So this is taken 40 years after their arrivals in Aliso Canyon. And they're all alive. So where did they come from? So the Thurston family and Snow families, they were part of the Mormon expedition that migrated into Salt Lake Valley in 1847. Harriet's father, George Thurston Sr., he was the son of one of the church's leaders. George had just completed 3 to 4 years of missionary work over in England. He comes back, and within a year, he marries Sarah Snow. Well, Sarah was the daughter of one of the church's 12 apostles, and she grew up in a plural marriage home. So this family is very well connected within the Mormon church. They've been living in Utah here for at least 10 years, very ingrained in the community there. They were pioneers in their own right and familiar with hardships. But then a tragedy happened in 1868. Their 2.5-year-old daughter, Rosetta, was kidnapped by Indians and never recovered. So after about 3 years, the Thurston family moved away from Salt Lake Valley, starting afresh, kind of leaving those painful memories behind. So they took the Transcontinental Railroad from Utah into San Francisco Bay Area. Then after being up there for a while, they took a paddle wheel steamer ship down to the San Diego. They were befriended by the Lovett family, who lived in Bear Valley, which is kind of by Escondido area, inland San Diego County. They stayed there for a while, had a daughter that was born, and then father, wanting homestead land, started moving northward to find that. And he eventually settled in an abandoned canyon in Aliso Canyon, and we'll return to that topic a little bit later today. I'm going to have Harriet's AI avatar read an abridged version of her preface. It's a little clunky, but she does a much better job introducing her book than I do. Here we go.
The present volume is not in any sense of the word intended as a history. Rather, it is the simple story of a single family of pioneers taken from among the many who formed an integral part of that romantic Southland. To tell this pioneer family experience in readable story form, free from fiction and full of human interest, has been the sole object and endeavor of the author. Therefore, a very great deal of matter that is most interesting in itself has been omitted as not contributory to the main objective. Events of an historical nature have been incorporated into the story only as they touched the lives of its characters. Yet in every such instance, painstaking care has been exercised to the end that such references be accurate, and thus truly informative. To supplement the author's incompleteness of knowledge of memory, so far as possible, first-hand accounts have been obtained from those who participated in or had personal knowledge of the events portrayed. A few words here of sincere appreciation and acknowledgement are due and here tendered those friends and relatives and other pioneers who have contributed, little or much, toward the making of this saga of the Southland. This story of the children of Aliso has been long in the making. First, it took 20 years to live it, then it took twice 20 years to live it down. Since then, it has taken several years more to live it over.
First, it took 20 years to live it. Then it took twice 20 years to live it down. And since then, it has taken several years more to live it over. So Harriet wrote her memoirs from 1935 to her passing in 1948. Her daughter, Augusta Morton, had the manuscript typed, proofread, and bound into 3 volumes for the family. And so for 75 years, Harriet's family has cared for this manuscript, always intending to publish it. Augusta was the keynote speaker at the centennial celebration in 1971 and read excerpts from this book. And here's a copy of the 3-volume set that Augusta had distributed around to the family. So that was over 50 years ago, and local historians have kind of been looking forward to seeing this book published ever since. So it was in 2023 that my cousin Ted and I, we collaborated to get the book published. Now there's a lot of formatting to get the book typeset and ready for e-publication. We incorporated family photographs and maps as Harriet had desired. And we also included some endnotes to provide appropriate historical context. We didn't want to disturb the manuscript, so it's essentially unedited and faithfully represents her story in that culture's time and place. Ted and I felt a responsibility to get this shared, get the heritage shared here with the community. Ted had made a commitment to his grandmother to get it published. Myself, I had a desire to advance Laguna Beach history, to honor my historian mentors Merle and Mabel Ramsey, who had invested so much in me in the 70s. Actually, Ted and I, we did not know each other prior to 2023. It's kind of a fun story, but the bottom line is we found each other and we shared this common goal to get the book published. We worked remotely using collaboration tools. Ted's back in Pennsylvania, I'm out here in California. In fact, we had never physically met until we got the book published in early 2024. But in going through the photographs, Ted and I found that we actually had crossed paths 50 years ago at that centennial celebration. Here's Augusta, Harriet's daughter, holding court out on the Ben Brown's golf course. Wow. And Ted is there on the left. He's a young medical school student, and I'm just barely into my teenage years in Thurston Junior High, sitting down there on the right. So that was kind of fun.
He's got a big camera there too.
He does. He has a very nice camera. So the book is published in both a hardback and a paperback version. They're printed on demand by Ingram Spark. And so I'll have this up here at the end if anybody's interested in ordering a copy for themselves. They are printed on demand. You can get them from Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but they'll just mark it up, okay? So this gives you the best price. Copies of the book are already on deposit here at the library in Laguna, at the Historical Society there, downtown, and also out at UCI at their Special Collections Research Library. So where are we at? We're going to dive into some of Harriet's themes and her stories. So Harriet starts off and describes how the Thurston family came into Aliso Canyon, where they found a one-room abandoned cabin. There was a lot of uncertainty about available public land during this period. The exact boundary lines of where rancho boundaries started and stopped and where public land was available, it wasn't known until the first government surveys for this specific region were completed in 1873 and 75. So prior to those official surveys, the only right to unsurveyed public lands was possession by a squatter. So as long as they stuck, no one could dispute your right of occupancy. And the Thurstons took possession in 1871 in November. And once the land was surveyed, the occupant was always given the first right to acquire the land on which they settled. So Thurston filed his claim in 1874. He spent the requisite number of years to satisfy all the requirements, and he was granted his homestead in 1879. The Thurstons did have to adjust their boundaries a little bit. Once the survey was done, they found out they were on some non-public land, and so they adjusted, and that was all good. So this figure here merges the two survey maps from 73 and 1875. You see the Thurston homestead in the blue oval there. You can see Thurston House. If you look real closely, you can see something called vineyard that they had, and the Rancho Niguel is clearly seen there on the right. By the way, these maps are available on the government's BLM website. You can download them for free. They're very interesting. Here's a copy of Orange County's map when Orange County was carved out of LA, 1889. And I have this up here so you can see this triangle of public land, which is Laguna Beach, bounded on the right by the Rancho Niguel. And then on the left, in kind of that reddish tint, is the Rancho San Joaquin. So Harriet then describes how they had some neighbor trouble. Cyrus Rawson, who owned the Niguel Rancho, he attempted to expand his land to include the Thurston's homestead. He had purchased the rancho from the Yorba and the Aguiar families, and his view was that his ranch boundaries should have included the entire coastline area from Laguna Canyon all the way down to Salt Creek. And so Laguna Beach would have been, I guess, part of those planned communities, right? So Rawson made life pretty difficult for the Thurston family in his attempts to move them off their farm. He let his cattle graze through their crops. Harriet describes how he illegally installed a locked gate to close the public Aliso Canyon Road, which cut the Thurstons off from their water sources and also to the routes to the nearby cities up in Tustin, Santa Ana. And then, so what would happen, Father would drive out the canyon on one of his trips. He'd get out his tools, he'd knock the padlock off the gate and just keep going. So Cyrus Rawson litigated him through the courts for malicious mischief. And authorities would come out, they'd arrest him, they'd throw him in jail, he'd have to get bailed out, he'd be forced to go to court up in Orange County, sometimes having to go to LA. And they're poor. They're racking up legal debt from all these lawsuits. And eventually they countersued him for malicious prosecution. But things ended well for the Thurstons. I like this quote that Harriet has when the subsequent owner, Lewis Moulton, bought the rancho around 1881. She said, Mr. Moulton was a kindly man, a friend to everyone in need, and greatly beloved as a neighbor. So things ended well. So when they came into Aliso, there was a small deserted sheep herder's cabin about 10 by 11 feet, she said. And she said about the yard lay several dead cattle and sheep. The ground was treeless, rocky, and pitted with squirrel holes. So the Thurstons had arrived at the final stages of one of Southern California's drought years. They pitched a tent, she said about 11 feet from the cabin, and created a wooden plank floor under the tent extending to the cabin. Then they took the canvas cover off their wagon and stretched it between the tent and the cabin. And they lived like this for several years until weather just kind of tore it apart, finally ending with a violent storm that really ripped it up. There's no screens on the windows, and Harriet describes the flies as just miserable. Their small cabin was gradually expanded, and other farm structures were added. Here we see the expanded cabin. See, I think chapter 22 It kind of describes the room, and Harriet provides a bunch of layout sketches for the whole cabin there. So they lived like that for about 20 years. Not everybody slept in the cabin. Eventually some of the guys would be sleeping in a barn and other places, the honey house. So their 24-year-old son, Leif, he drafted up the plans and built the new house in 1891. As you can see, it's a two-story, but the most important thing, they actually had running water into the kitchen. Harriet, in chapter 55, describes the house and its construction in a lot of detail. Leif did most of the construction here because the older children had moved off to the neighboring communities and they're working. They would come down and help Leif during their time off on the weekends, but he did most of it. Here's a picture looking west towards the mouth of the cabin. I don't know the exact date on this. Yeah, so well, you see the main house here. Let me come around. See the main house, and you have several in there somewhere. I'm not sure. There's a honey house. There's a cistern that feeds water by gravity into the house. You have an orchard down there. You have a windbreak of eucalyptus trees towards the mouth of the cabin. But I'll talk about the crops that they grew later on in the presentation.
It also looks like there's been some grading of the water course.
Yeah. Well, they definitely plowed the fields.
No, but I mean, it looks like the creek looks like it's been dug out and,
Yeah, they might have done some of that. Harriet didn't describe any infrastructure improvements that way.
yeah.
So a lot of what was done was probably nature's course. Oh yeah, down at the mouth of the highway is the eventual highway, the coast road that was put in, but that wasn't there for many years.
That's you can see all
Okay. So education is one of Harriet's themes throughout her memoir. This really went to her core. She wasn't given the opportunity to attend a formal school until age 16. The Thurston children were mostly homeschooled in rudimentary subjects. They did their studies at night, most of the time after the day's farm chores were done. Older children helped teach the younger ones using passed down readers as well as copybooks. Of course, they used slate boards because paper is a precious commodity. Eventually, the younger children were able to attend several years of school while working and living with others in surrounding communities. And then the youngest children were able to attend school up in Santa Ana once the mother moved off the farm in 1895. Harriet described some of the barriers that they had to formal schooling. When they arrived, the nearest school was about 16 miles away down in Capistrano. As Laguna started forming in with neighbors, there was a school established up in Laguna Canyon about 4 miles away. And she said, a lot of times they were just penned in by the weather. High rains, high water for 3 months at a time. I think some of the schooling was probably arranged around harvest times when kids were needed to work the farms and the crops. So she said it's just the weather made it very difficult for regular attendance if we were to go. And she said besides we were very poor. Everyone was needed to work the farm. We couldn't spare any horses or wagons to take the kids to school. It was too far to walk. And furthermore, they had no money to buy appropriate school clothes or even supplies. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about Harriet tonight. Regarding water, the Aliso Creek water was brackish, distasteful, so you had to haul your water from its limited sources. Well, the Thurstons, they went 3 miles up the canyon to Wood Canyon on the Rawson Ranch, and they hauled their potable water for about 9 to 10 years this way. The Goffs, who lived just north and south of the Thurstons, did the same thing. Harriet describes how Hemingway dug a small well in Laguna Canyon that helped him and Henry Goff, who had land down by Hotel Laguna area. And she also describes Nate Brooks tunneling into one of the hillsides where there was a seepage there in Arch Beach and getting a little water. She describes how Gentleman McManus dug deep wells just north and south of Aliso Canyon on the Goff property with little success. And he also dug a well in his land above Three Bay. No success. Regarding medical, they were on their own. You know, there's no nearby doctors to help with any serious illnesses or accidents. Harriet describes cases of pneumonia, influenza, whooping cough, dental issues. She said her parents had a doctor book, and they also relied on medicinal herbs and some natural remedies. She describes the disinfectant that her mother made from vinegar, turpentine, egg whites, and some ammonia. When contagious diseases were coming through the area, the kids would have to wear this pungent gum in little bags, little sacks around their necks next to their skin. They also consumed some of it as little tablets, and Harriet said, oh, it just tasted awful. There was a belief that they needed to purify their blood in the spring, and so they would take the sulfur cream of tartar honey mixture over a course of several weeks in the spring. She describes how her father how his teeth were rotting out, needed to have them pulled and replaced with some plates, kind of replacing one problem with another. Well, he went to the dentist in Santa Ana and paid him to pull out one of the teeth, decided that he didn't want to pay to have the rest of them done, so he found a tree on the farm and pulled out the rest of his teeth there in Aliso. When he needed to be stitched up through a serious cut, they just used a needle and some coarse white thread. So it was tough. You are on your own. So on a more pleasant note, Harriet describes the natural landscape beauty through her memoirs, the creeks, the canyons, the beach, rocks, cliffs, mountains, the caves. A pretty detailed description of the flora and the fauna, and also the sounds and the smells. I really like this quote from her. Of all our wonderful playgrounds, the most fraught with memories, the most invigorating, the most broadening in influence was the long series of white sandy beaches, framed in the background of mountains and mesas, jutting bluffs, overhanging cliffs, and fronting the grand, the beautiful, the loved old ocean. Here we played, we bathed, we hunted the sea's treasures, we picnicked, we explored, we fished, we reveled in freedom, we lived. What a wonderful time. Here's a picture of what she calls Eagle Rock. It was also eventually known as Camel Rock. She said they named it Eagle Rock because ospreys would build their nest on the topmost height. However, erosion finally came in and knocked off the topmost portion, so now it's looking like a camel. Well, eventually the head and the neck fall off, and now it just looks like another rock. Here's another picture of 3 arches. I don't have the dates for these. It's pretty natural, but it's great. Here's a picture of Goff Island. Harriet describes the local wildlife as it relates to their farming, their food sources, and their personal safety. It's not an inventory of all the animals that they encountered, just the ones that encountered as far as her story. So they definitely have mountain lions and bobcats, the coyotes, rattlesnakes. They had a lot of those. Harriet loved the birds. She describes the birds in a lot of detail. Their colorations, the sounds, she phonetically spells out the sounds that the birds were making, their habitats, describing their behavior, their benefits to the farming, as well as their nuisances. This is just a list of some of the birds that Harriet mentions in her book. Not meant to be exhaustive, but it's a wonderful thing that she wrote, because you don't have all these birds anymore in our area. She describes the natural flora of the region, the trees with the sycamores, oaks, the box elders and willows, the saltgrass and malvea along the creek, over the hillsides with the chaparral brush, the nettle, sumac, and cactus. And she said that would take this black brea, that's what she called it, a seaweed off the rocks, and use that as a chewing gum. She said it was an acquired taste. And they wouldn't get it close to the rocks at the shore because it had too much sand in it, so they were trying to always pull it off the rocks that were a little further away from the shore. They planted a lot of trees on the farm. Pepper trees were planted along the rock walls to provide some shade and beauty. There were willows, poplars, and acacia trees planted along the sides of the creek, and of course the eucalyptus trees. She describes a lot of the wildflowers. One of the things she says, other flowers of many hues grew upon this beautiful hill in the springtime, scattered here and there among the grass and the bushes and the poison oak. So over the years, Harriet says that they transformed this barren wilderness into a little garden of Eden. And these are some of the products that they produced on the farm. A lot of different dairy products from their cows, meat and eggs from their cattle, hogs, ducks, geese, chickens. And they started doing some ocean fishing, but not right away. They had a lot of honey. You can read the vegetables that they grew there. Regarding fruit, they grew melons, but they also had an orchard of some apple trees, peaches, pears, nectarines, plums, figs, olives. And then they had a vineyard. They went up to the Anaheim colony and selected 3 varieties of grapes. And Harriet said that the Zinfandel variety grew best down in Aliso Canyon for them. They also had walnut and almond trees as part of their orchards. And of course, they also grew alfalfa and barley. So everyone shared in the chores and the responsibilities. Some of the chores included, if you were a 5-year-old boy, you got to herd the ducks down to the creek in the early morning, fending off any coyotes. You turn 8, you're able to herd the cattle up on the hillsides by yourself. Maybe your dog with you. If you're young, you also got to protect the orchards and fields. You're kind of posted at the corners of the fields to chase away birds, rabbits, and squirrels that were going to eat your crop. You're also clearing stone from the crop fields. Of course, the older boys carried a heavy load of the outdoor work. And Harriet said since there weren't enough boys, I was mostly given outside work. So she talks about herding hogs, pruning and weeding, harvesting crops, cutting wood, carrying water, guiding the horse through when plowing through the fields. She said the girls had a very large domestic workload, cooking, preserving, making household goods, raising chickens, ducks, geese, hogs, cleaning, washing, ironing clothes, sewing, patching, repatching the patches, she said, and darning. She said all the work sewing was done by hand for the first 10 years until they got a sewing machine. And she said there's a lot of clothes and linens to be sewn by hand. So in 1881, a traveling salesman came through, sold them a sewing machine. Well, there's kind of a funny story. There was actually 2 different traveling salesmen with 2 different sewing machine products, and naively they got snookered into buying 2. So they did. Laundry tasks, used a washboard for the first 17 years. Harriet describes in 88 how they got their first one, replacing that washboard. She said, for many years, rubbing on that board was the only method known to us of washing clothes. And this, for a family the size of ours, was a wearisome and protracted task. When I was 12 years of age, we had our first washing machine, a wooden hand turner that made the work go a little faster, but almost broke the back to operate as we pulled and pushed that handle back and forth across the machine with its heavy load. It's a tough life. So, entertainment, musical instruments. The family bought a reed organ back in 1885, and the girls learned to play that. They actually traded 2 old horses and a young cow to purchase it. Traveling salesman comes through, sells this thing, and he walks off with the horses and cow. They have an organ. The boys learned to play the fiddle. In fact, George Jr., the oldest boy, built his first fiddle. One of the family friends, Harry Hughes, who married one of the daughters, he played the concertina. It's kind of similar to an accordion. And of course, they had harmonicas, mouth harps, comb and paper. She describes their parties. The annual Valentine's Day parties sounded like a lot of fun. sharing anonymous valentines with the other neighbors, trying to guess who sent them to them. Local dances, Hubbard Goff played the fiddle and was actually the caller for many of those dances. Harriet describes these dances in a lot of detail. You kind of see how they did things. It's very interesting. She also describes just their pastimes, the games that they created as children. Some of them are familiar and some of them just created from their imaginations. It's very interesting. Then going back a couple years to their start, she says it was really hard in these early years. In 1871, as I mentioned, they arrived at the latter years of the drought period. Harriet said all we could see ahead of them was hardship, loneliness, and isolation, for there were no neighbors anywhere, and father had but $40 to his name. She said, quote, food was scarce and money scarcer. So for many months, no milk, butter, fruit, or vegetables. They had 2 meals a day, and it was bean soup and cornbread. And initially I mentioned they weren't adept at ocean fishing, but that was eventually added in. Harriet said children were always barefoot. Their clothes were patched and repatched. She said once you were considered not a child, then I guess somehow you got shoes, but for the most part, the children ran barefoot, walked barefoot through the valley, through the canyon there. Just a couple stories I pulled out about accidents and setbacks. They had recently harvested their hay as about a year's worth of feed, and it was kind of accidentally burned up by a careless neighbor. They had let their cattle feed on too much of the green feed in the field one year, and many of them loaded up and died. A very scary cliff landslide happened right behind their home. No one was killed, or the home was not destroyed, fortunately. Family dogs accidentally getting poisoned by the rancher's strychnine. So when there's a carcass there, ranchers would put strychnine in there to kill off the coyotes. Well, you know, your family dogs, working dogs, are also loose. Birds and other things feeding on it also succumbed. It also describes how one of the kids was cleaning the brush off one of the hillsides and accidentally started a big wildfire. Let's see. There was also the fatal hunting accident of a young family friend that was visiting down in that area. Leif almost lost his eye through a revolver accident. The oldest son nearly drowned. He was a pretty adept swimmer, but almost drowned one time. One of the young daughters was run over by the heavy farm wagon, and of course many rattlesnake near misses. So she includes all these kind of stories interspersed, just telling about their life. So where are we at tonight? We'll talk about some of the neighbors. It's interesting here, Harriet's description of the Goffs and the Brooks and the Hemingway and other families that moved in around them. And then we'll talk about the family members themselves. So Harriet wrote of their initial isolation in Aliso Canyon. She said it was a lonesome place to live. There were no neighbors unless a few men without families scattered here and there through the country could be called neighbors. She said, Father made contacts with the outside world on his various trading trips, often passing the night with some family by the way. But from other than the children, for years and years, life was almost wholly without social contacts. She said it was a happy day in 1877 when they discovered we had neighbors. They'd been around for 1.5 years. So this is when Harvey Hemingway and Henry Goff rode horseback kind of over the hills. There's no coast road. And they found out, hey, we have neighbors in Aliso Canyon, 4 miles away. So as other families started moving in, the surveys were kind of complete. People knew where public land was. People start moving into Laguna and around the area. So we start seeing the supporting friendships develop. So for neighbors, Henry Goff and Harvey Hemingway came to Laguna in 1876 for the public land. Harriet says that they moved from Kansas in 1874 and settled up in Westminster raising hogs. Henry was married to Harvey's sister Libby. Harvey had that blue section up here out further out in the canyon, and Henry Goff homesteaded a little bit of land where Hotel Laguna is. In fact, he built the first crude little hotel down there, a very kind of board and bath kind of home that kept getting expanded, and that was eventually sold to a man named Spencer and then to Joseph Yock. Then came Frank, Henry's brother. He settled in 1879. Harriet says that they came from Massachusetts in 1877 and were living up in what they called Comptonville at the time with his brothers. Well, Frank homesteaded land just to the north side of Aliso. So Aliso's in a canyon, and you kind of come up onto that mesa, and they called it the Frank Goff Bench. Frank raised cattle in the Blue Canyon area with George Rogers. And this is all from Harriet's description of these families and their stories in her book. She said Hubbard Goff came next, and he left Compton, settled in the Arch Beach area. You see the little triangle of land up there, it says Hubbard Goff on there. That's where he homesteaded land. Harriet describes him as a carpenter, a blacksmith, just a general jack of all trades. He built houses, made wagons, sharpened plows, made farming tools. He actually built some of the structures on the Thurston farm, and he taught Leif, who built the second home, the new home for the Thurstons, he taught him the carpentry trade. So thank you, Hubbard. Hubbard also played the fiddle for the neighborhood dances I had mentioned. He made his own violins. Hubbard ended up building the Arch Beach Hotel, which was eventually bought by a man named Ambrose, and then who sold it to Joseph Yock. And I think some of you know how Yock had the hotel cut up and then moved across the canyons and joined in with the Laguna Hotel. So Lee Goff, the other Goff brother, came down from Compton next, settled in Laguna around 1880, according to Harriet, and he homesteaded land on the south side of the Thurstons, and they called that mesa Lee Goff Bench. Well, eventually Lee and Frank sold off their land as part of the real estate boom, and they moved back up in the Tustin area. The Brooks brothers, very well-known name here in Laguna, William, Nate, and Oliver Brooks. They settled here. Their mother, Mrs. Draper, Harriet says she was a sister of Harvey Hemingway and Libby Goff. So it appears that the Brooks, the Goffs, and the Hemingway families were all related. The Brooks homestead land from the ocean all the way up into the hills, you see there in blue. She says that William Brooks ran the first local store here. The bachelor, Nate, he homesteaded land between Laguna and Arch Beach. He actually harvested hay and built the Arch Beach Pier to ship the hay back down to San Diego. He developed a little water source tunneling into his hillside. And then Nate and Hubbard collaborated to subdivide land and sell lots in Arch Beach and to build the Arch Beach Hotel, supplying water from his hillside source. She also describes a couple cattlemen, John Dameron and Pankey, who arrived in '74. They had a large number of horses and cattle that kind of roamed the unfenced hills to the detriment of farmers, she said. They had some homesteading, they homesteaded some land in Laguna Canyon between Hemingway and Goff. And she also mentions the Henry Rogers, the George Rogers families, George Fountain living further up the canyon, and of course Laguna's first breeder, old Joe Lucas, and Andrew Wesley Thompson. So for the family, Harriet's memoir is very transparent about her perspective of the family relationships and their collaborative hard work on the farm. It can be kind of raw at times, but it's real. It's wonderful, and so we can appreciate the realistic descriptions of their pioneering life, the joys, sorrows, just the hopes and disappointments. And so we'll start with the father, George Thurston Sr. So family histories describe him as pretty difficult and authoritarian and abusive, which made life all that much harder. Harriet describes her father's temperament throughout her memoir. Joe Thurston, in his book, Laguna Beach of Early Days, that he published in 1947 initially, also describes this. And the mother's life sketch, his wife's life sketch that she wrote in 1912, kind of also mentioned this. He had a number of really strong qualities, but his continued abuse was wrong and had its unfortunate consequences. So his adult children finally confronted him in August of 1887, and he gracefully left. We think he went up to LA and then to San Francisco, and then the federal census records, we see him down in Galveston right before the big hurricane and flood of 1900, and we think he perished as part of that, as one of the thousands. His wife, in her memoir, she said, it was the isolated situation of the canyon where there just was no restraining influence of community there. And the he became more violent and overbearing over time, which just kind of ended up a separation due to the cruelty of his wife and children. So, but he had a lot of strong qualities, but just very unfortunate. Harriet includes many stories of her mother through the book. She said her mom rarely left the canyon home, and it wasn't like her. I think she took her first trip off the farm 17 years later, in 1888. She took a train trip to see her daughter Sadie and family in Phoenix. In 1895, Mom is about in her mid-50s. Oldest son George convinced her to move to Santa Ana for a little bit more restful life, and this also allowed the youngest daughters to attend school. She died at age 87, 1928, up in Santa Ana. The oldest son, George, he was about 12 years old when the family arrived in Aliso, and he left the farm at age 21 in 1880. So he worked various jobs as a laborer, did some mining. He went into a fish sales partnership with the Goffs, and also ranch hand in Tustin. Eventually, he filed a land claim out in the San Jacinto Valley in 1884. He also speculated on some lots in Arch Beach during that real estate craze. Chapter 45 has a really interesting story. George is very trusting, probably naive, but wonderful character. Meets an unscrupulous guy who takes advantage of him, and now he's overextended. And it's a wonderful story of how Nate Brooks got together with him, developed a plot and a counterplot, and extracted George out of this really bad financial deal. It's quite interesting to read. So a year later, George meets Minnie Reynolds, his wife, as she was camping with her cousins down at Aliso Beach. They are married later that year. Harriet says, where is it here? In chapter 49. George was attracted to his future wife since she did not wear the bustle. He was immediately captivated and he lost his heart to her. Eventually in 1891 he purchased some land down near Three Arches, and then we find him living up in Santa Ana, and then Montebello, and then Monterey Park. Their second son, Erastus, he died at age 3. There was a dysentery epidemic that was kind of going through the Salt Lake Valley area, and he died. Sarah, known as Sadie, the oldest daughter, she was 9 years old when this family settled into Aliso. She was actually the first to leave the Aliso farm at 18. She left a couple months before George did. And she lived with various families to help care for their children and their households. In fact, her first job was she went down to live with William and Annie Brooks in Laguna and helped them. And eventually did the same thing up in Santa Ana and Tustin. And then eventually she moved down to Phoenix, Arizona as part of those responsibilities. She met her husband down there, and she's actually able to start attending school. So that's like at age 20. Sometime before 1910, they moved back to San Bernardino. Her husband's working as a carpenter. Here's a picture of Arthur and Sadie and their children. By the way, this was the style of photographs, and there's no smiling. Artemisia, she was about 8 years old when the family arrived in Aliso. She left the farm at age 19 in 1882. She found work in surrounding towns, similar work, household, caring for children and just running the households. And she was up in Santa Ana, Tustin, Norwalk, Colton around. And she also picked up some jobs at factory stores and restaurants and hotels. It was interesting reading about her at the hotel in Avalon. And Artie seemed to be pretty independent and put off courtships and marriage for a number of years. It was when she was working at the Transcontinental Hotel in Colton, that's where she met her husband, Charlie Ward. When she met Charlie, he was employed organizing semi-pro baseball teams in Pomona in that area, and I think also down in Texas. So he wasn't around much. He was gone a lot, and then he'd come back, and Artie wanted something more stable. And so this is how Charlie eventually became getting into law enforcement, working as a constable in Ontario and then Colton. There's some wonderful letters that Harriet shares in her book. It's chapter 54 that kind of recounts her whole courtship. So they initially lived in Ontario, and Charlie eventually became the deputy sheriff for San Bernardino County. So this is them and their children. Rosetta. So she was kidnapped by Chief Pocatello's tribe in 1868 in Mendon, Utah. She was never found, as I mentioned, after a 3-year search. Harriet kind of recounts this story in chapter 22, talking with her mother about the whole account there. You can also read about this in the local newspapers in Utah in the 1868, 1869 Desert News newspaper accounts. It provides nice insights into life of the local tribes, just the good relationships that they had, and then also bad actors. Father offered a $5,000 reward for a return, which is more than $100,000 in today's currency. Their grief was the primary impetus probably for Father to leave Utah. It seems to be a unilateral decision that he made, and this is probably my overlay on this. It just seems like his grief translated into a total abandonment of everything that anchored his life. As I said, the family was very well connected to the church. They had been in this community for well over 10 years. And then they up and leave. Mother was pretty distraught at leaving the family there in Utah. So it's interesting that Harriet recounts a story that in 1923, the family believes that Rosetta may have actually survived and married to an Arapaho chief, Brokenhorn, and her name was probably Susie Brokenhorn. And so Harriet's epilogue kind of recounts a story. There was the Indians were part of this cast for a movie that they were filming called The Covered Wagon, and it was showing at the Hollywood Theater up there. And the Indians moved away after their engagement was done, and nothing known for certain, but you can read the newspaper accounts during these years that got a lot of publicity in the Long Beach and the Los Angeles papers. But it was just kind of a tragic thing, opened up old wounds for the mother, but never knew. Lafayette, he was about 4 years old when the family arrived in Aliso. At age 16, he ran away. He left the farm after a very bitter and violent disagreement with his father. He ran away, lived with friends up in Artemisia, worked and started attending school. And then about a year later, his brother said, "Hey, come out and live with me, help me out on my farm out in San Jacinto Valley." So he does that. It's interesting how barren this was. Harriet describes how he got a ride from Artesia up to Riverside with friends, and then he has to start hoofing it. He's hiking 35, 40 miles over a couple of days to his brother's place out in San Jacinto. As I mentioned, Hub Goff had taught Leif the carpentry trade, and so he worked on a lot of the projects in the Arch Beach area, the hotel, the pier, cottages, as well as projects on the farm. Here's the house, again, that Leif built. His brother-in-law, Artie's husband, tried to get him into some law enforcement, so he got deputized as a constable up in Uplands. And Charlie realized that Leif just did not have the disposition to deal with rough people, and he'd eventually get himself killed. So he wisely got out of that, returned to farming and carpentry. He was building a group of dwellings out in El Toro area in 1894. He met his future wife, Ella Cox, who was at the local grocery store working there. Okay, Joe Thurston. He was about 3 years old when they came to Aliso. He's the one who remained on the farm, carried an increasing workload. He's seen his older brothers and siblings kind of moving away, finding their way in the surrounding community. So he had to hire some helpful laborers. He's the one who made regular wagon trips in Laguna to sell the farm produce. He's looking around and saying, "Hey, my brothers and sisters, they're looking at what life is like around the surrounding communities. Maybe I'd like to do that." So his brother Frank comes down to manage the farm for about 2 years, and Joe tries his hand at some other things, and he says, "I like the farm." He comes back in 1896. Recall that his mother had already moved up to Santa Ana. Joe takes over the farm, buys the farm from her, and works it for many years. Here's a picture of Joe with his melon crop in 1900. Here's their wedding picture. He married Marie Harding Frazier. She was one of Laguna's first long-term teachers and the first principal of the grade school in 1913. In fact, Thurston Middle School is named after her. And of course, Joseph, he wrote his family's pioneer life story in Laguna Beach of early days, published in 1947. Nice picture of the shoes hanging out the window there. That was at their home on Park Avenue. Joan she was born down in Bear Valley, and so she was 3 months old when the family came into Aliso. The Thurston children, they befriended a couple of boys, Harry and Bob, who were camping down with their friends from Villa Park. That family, the Hughes family, had recently immigrated from England and worked up in the Silverado mines. Joan and Harry had this initial attraction. They eventually got married in 1890 on the farm. That was probably the first wedding in Aliso Canyon. So they lived up in Ladd's Canyon, up in Silverado, and by about 1900, I think Joan's health was a little difficult up there, so they moved back into Santa Ana. There's a colorized picture that the family had of Joan and her children. There's a story about how Harry Hughes, Joan's husband, and his brother-in-law, Leif, they discovered a significant coal deposit up in Santiago Canyon. So they developed a cover story that they're starting up a bee ranch, and they bought up all the land around there and built up the infrastructure. And they eventually sold that mine in 1907 to a set of investors organized as the Orange County Coal Mining Company. And then she also describes how Harry then took his other brother-in-law, Frank, with him down to Colombia on a mining venture. He was employed by a French company along the Crystal River. So they did that for a couple years. Joan, by the way, subsequently married William Galen Doss in 1936. And so we know William Doss here, he was one of our very famous local authors. Hulda was one of the other daughters. In fact, her name was initially Honey, after their bee honey product for 6 years. And so when the federal census workers start showing up around, I guess it would be 1880, about 6 years later, they have to give her a name. So it's Hulda. She eventually took a dressmaking apprenticeship and ended up marrying William Walls in 1896, and they lived up in Orange. They eventually bought a farm down at the base of the Salton Sea. Frank was born on the farm. Again, at 18, he left the farm, started working in the surrounding areas. Kind of a tragic thing happened in 1900. He really overextended himself financially, and he suffered a complete loss of everything. He had a large grain crop acreage. He's growing up on the Irvine Ranch and just lost everything. It was a hard time for Frank. Eventually, he lived down in Nashville City, down in San Diego County. Here's a picture of Frank, second from the left. As I mentioned, he went down to Colombia for a couple of years with Harry. In 1924, he died down in Chile. He had gone down there to work for a copper mining company. He died of a heart failure. Harriet, our author. Okay, so she's born in 1876 in the farm. Really, at the core of Harriet's being, she just wanted to be educated and go to school. And she says it was one of my major sorrows. So she finally got that opportunity when she's 16 years old. She went to go live with her sister Artie and her husband Charlie up in Ontario. And here's this 16-year-old girl. She's put in the 4th grade with 4th grade children. And Harriet says, "How shall I relate the experience of my first year at school? One has to live many years after a great humiliation before it becomes funny enough to be told to others for their amusement." But I read this as the story of self-determination to persevere, to learn despite her circumstances. See, the family was so poor, and during this time, they scraped up enough money to make just one dress, and she wore that one dress every day to school. Harriet, I'm trying to get to a quote here. In 1895, she went up to live with Clara Mason on her homestead in Silverado Canyon. Clara Mason was a school teacher at the mountain school up there. She has a wonderful thing. She says that years spent in the mountains of Silverado Canyon with Clara Mason, that friend of so many talents, did wonders for me. She left an impression upon her 19-year-old friend and admirer, such that few others have left. What a wonderful thing is education rightly used! Exclamation point. How much it may be made to bless others besides ourselves! Exclamation point. And what a marvelously potent power for good it is when yoked up with human kindness! Exclamation point. It was a wonderful time in her life. She subsequently attended a business college in LA, and then she was married in 1897. We find her living down in Capistrano with her first daughter in 1900. Then they're up in Santa Ana, eventually out in Bakersfield, and then 1935 to 48. She spent many of these years writing her memoirs, Children of Aliso. So Annie, we're getting near the end of the children here. She's much younger. She's a couple years younger than Harriet, and she gets to go off to school while Harriet's staying back on the farm working. So she gets to go off to school in Phoenix for about 3 years. And she eventually marries William, of course, and they live up in Orange, and he's a beekeeper. Charlotte, born 1879 on the farm, she barely survived her infancy, whooping cough and pneumonia at an early age. She was one that got to go aboard with some families out in El Toro and attend the local school, quite much younger at age 14 than the other children were. She eventually took a business course in LA, and she marries this gentleman, William Jennings, who ran an automotive cover shop up in Orange. Luella, age 11, again, much younger than the older children. It gets a little bit easier for the younger ones. She went up to live with her sister Joan and her husband Harry up in the mountain school in Silverado, 10 school. Harriet says that she graduated as a valedictorian from Santa Ana High in 1902, and then she attended UC Berkeley several years later. We find her teaching English and Spanish up in Oxnard and Monterey. She went off to Spain to study Spanish, but came back because World War I was breaking out. And in 1915, she married Ernest Little, and they lived up in Washington State. The youngest, Clarabelle, again, she barely survived childhood after a bout with pneumonia. She married Harold Garland, who was a concrete worker, and they lived up in Santa Ana. So just to kind of summarize, this book, it's 500 pages. It's very detailed. It's basically, again, it's unedited, kind of faithfully represents Harriet's story in that culture's time and place, so you have to kind of read it, not putting, our current overlay on it. I love her descriptions of the region's, untouched flora, fauna, the beautiful landscapes. Dozens of Harriet poems are interspersed throughout her memoir. It's a wonderful thing. At least 2 dozen of her poems are scattered through the stories. Family photographs, drawing letters are included. We indexed it, so it's easy to find certain topics. And then again, as I said, we included a bunch of endnotes in there to provide additional historical context and references. We just didn't want to disturb her manuscript in any way, her story. So that's kind of the overview of the book, kind of long-winded, but that's the story. So I guess it's time for, if anybody has questions, try and answer them. Yes, sir.
Questions or comments? Be sure to talk in the microphone so we can get you on our video.
Thank you, that was great. So I would say for a 500-page book, it's really kind of an easy read. It's so well written, and it's fun, and like you said, her poetry and her descriptions are incredible. I do have a question about, we know that there were stagecoach lines that came into town. One was where 133 is, and the other one came through what I think was their property.
Yeah, probably to Arch Beach. Yeah, they were running stages to Arch Beach as well.
Yeah, because she didn't describe that too much. You would think that they would describe when stages were coming through their property.
Yeah. We didn't get to hear her in her preface. She says she left out a lot of historical detail because it was just secondary to the story that she was trying to tell. So, yeah, it was probably very nice to see people coming down the public road there through Aliso Canyon. You're so isolated.
Yeah.
Wow, it must be nice to see people.
Well, thank you.
I have a question. Did Mother ever publish her life story that you mentioned from 1919?
Yeah, it's only about 2 pages. She called it a life sketch. And we did include it. We thought it was really important to include it in the set of endnotes. And so you'll have that. And we also included a letter from the father to Joan after he had separated. And, it's just important to see a couple different perspectives of things. So both those are in the endnotes.
Any other comments?
Scott, where did all of these things get stored over the years or passed down to, the photos, the letters, all the things that you had access to?
Well, I say that I think, Angela, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Ted had the boxes.
Of pictures or photos?
Of the manuscript, pictures and photos.
It's interesting that you asked that. So I'm not exactly sure where the original manuscript is. So Harriet's older daughter, Augusta, my grandmother, she had it printed and bound. And I remember those bound books. And I have a set, right? And those are the set that I know you worked off of, Scott. So, I think Augusta had some of them, and then Ted had the rest. But I had the books in my house for years.
Yeah. Some of the photographs that we included were from Harriet's collection, and others. There's pictures like from the railroad spike ceremony. We pulled that off the Thoreau archives and noted it and such. Some of the photographs also were just part of a historical collection that I had with Merle Mabel Ramsey. And some of those may have come from First American Title Trust Company, but they also had them there. We kind of cited that as well. But all those photographs and all that information is out at UCI in their special collections.
Any comment on that? She just wanted me to make a comment about the aspect of the impact of the book or Harriet on my family. So I am Harriet's great-granddaughter. I'm the youngest of 8 children, so Harriet's granddaughter had 8 kids. Not as many as 13, but I don't even, it's not working, is it? Yeah, it is. It's your voice. Is it working now?
There you go.
So I would say, to emphasize the importance of education, right? Harriet mentioned it over and over again. Harriet's younger daughter, Evelyn, became a medical doctor. She actually went to medical school and graduated from medical school in 25, 27. And in 1927, women were not allowed to go to medical school at Harvard. So I think, Harriet really instilled in both of her daughters the worth of education, which then was passed down to the next generation and the generations after. So like all of my family, you know, became doctors, et cetera, professionals. So we, you know, highly educated individuals. Education, reading was very important to her, and she definitely passed it down through all the generations.
That's wonderful.
It's more of a comment than a question than just a statement. It's just amazing that they lived in this outdoors, nobody there, and now we have the Laguna Beach of today. And as you grew up and you had pictures, I'm sure you wonder what they would have thought of Laguna Beach today and staying in a hotel room at the ranch with a theme, and, you know, and it was farm to table, restaurant and things. And I wanted to ask maybe your thoughts on that, how you, if that discussion has been had throughout the years, and also about the term Little Yosemite. It's a beautiful canyon. It's magical to go there now. And just about, I've heard that term Little Yosemite also.
I personally, I haven't heard that term. Roger had mentioned that to me. That's nice. Regarding how, you know, Harriet describes himself, this is Harriet's term, I'm a country geek, okay? I think that was her term. And I'm attending school with all these other kids who grew up in the city. And so there was just this awareness that we're so different in terms of our upbringing. It was interesting. They brought Harriet's father down to the ranch, and supposedly he grew up in the city, and so they're playing farm tricks on the guy. You know, so I think they're very comfortable just knowing how to live amongst nature and carve a living out. And I think they're very comfortable with that, and they enjoyed playing farm tricks and country tricks on city boy.
It sounded like most of the children had farms and ranches themselves.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had they're either citrus trees or apiarists or other.
Being that they originated from one of the 12 originally in Salt Lake City, did they all continue? I think I remember in Joe's book that because of the father's dislike of the way things were handled, either when the daughter was kidnapped or whatever, they kind of gave up their Mormon faith. Did the other generations continue with that?
No, Harriet touches on it lightly through the book. If anything, I would probably call it agnostic. Okay. There wasn't any training in the religious training in the home, so I'd probably just call it more agnostic. Harriet describes her own path in the Seventh-day Adventist church in the book, but no, that was all left behind in Utah, and I kind of mentioned they just discarded everything. He discarded everything the father did that kind of anchored his life. And that was just part of his grief.
Any other comments, questions?
There's no mention of the bounty that was available on the coast? I mean, they lived at one of the perfect places to get lobster and abalone and clams and mussel and all the treats that the ocean has to offer.
It's mostly fishing that they finally discovered. I don't recall any stories of clams or abalone or lobsters. I mean, I could go back and do a word search through there, but mostly just fishing eventually.
One more, Scott. I remember Harriet talking about her mother not seeing another woman for many, many years. Do you remember how many that was? Seemed like it was 20-something.
It was a long time. She didn't take her first trip off the farm for about 17 years. When she finally went down to Phoenix. But others were starting to come through, but it was probably about a period of 6 to 7 years initially where, they didn't even know they had neighbors, off in Laguna Canyon. And people were not coming down that canyon road to the beach. There was no coast highway. Yeah, so it was a good number of years.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Your family story fascinates me. It's my favorite time period of Laguna Beach history. So this is really neat to hear some of the details. I started the book, but now I'm going to finish it.
Well, thank you all. Thank you very much.